The Pulse. We're today's news talk. The Pulse.
Well, hello and a very warm welcome back to the Andrew Eborn Show with me, Andrew Eborn. Who else? Well, today I'm joined by the brilliant Vicky Pryce, a regular on the show. Vicky is Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. In March 2026-25, Chancellor Rachel Reeves has just dropped her spring statement, tackling a 14 billion fiscal black hole, slashed growth forecasts and global chaos. Vicky's here to cut through the spin and give us the real story. Vicky, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. Of course, I'll do what I can, but we haven't actually seen all the details in yet, or at least have not had enough time to go through it all. But I can give my general view, if you like, which, she actually gave a very good performance, I have to say. I watched it. But when you look underneath, they were in real trouble, and they used them, whatever they could, whatever tricks they could that exist to get away with, the prospects ahead only just about meeting their fiscal rules.
Yeah, and as always with these things, the devil is in the detail. That's all going to be coming out. But Vicky, the OBR has halved its 2025 growth forecast from 2% to 1%. Reeves blames global uncertainty, but the critics say her tax hikes tanked the economy. Who's right, external storm or self-inflicted?
A lot of it is internal, I'm afraid. I mean, there is no doubt there's a lot of uncertainty around. We're worried a little bit right now about tariffs. We're worried about the geopolitics. But in reality, we were doing reasonably well. The geopolitics was still an issue before the election. Yes, of course, Trump hadn't got into the position he's in, but we saw a slowdown in growth from the middle of the year. Pretty soon, after the election, coinciding very much with the first pronouncements of Rachel Reeves, which are all about how there was this huge black hole and the need to do something about it, and making statements in Parliament straight away, which of course sapped consumer and business confidence, which actually is really the problem that we've seen over the last few months. Businesses have not been willing to invest. They haven't been willing to take on a lot more staff. What we've seen is unemployment has plateaued. Yes, it's not doing too badly, but it hasn't really moved very much. It's moved slightly up a little bit over the last few months. So overall, I think the economy has come to more or less a standstill to a considerable extent because of the policies that were introduced. Of course, they haven't taken an effect yet. They were intending to be introduced, which of course includes the increase in national insurance contributions for employers, which starts pretty soon now in the next few days.
Yeah, I mean, and it is interesting. I mean, she claims she's clawed back nearly £10 billion. It's £10 billion in fiscal headroom by 29-30. Just for the benefit of everybody, as you know, right here on the Andrew Eborn Show, I like to unpack the jargon, so work on the common, lowest common denominator. In simple terms, then what is fiscal headroom, and is this a win or just smoke and mirrors?
It's basically what is left by the end of the period over which you want to be measured in terms of achieving some of your fiscal rules. That means that there is a little bit of room for maneuver if something goes wrong, so you've got a little bit left. But if you've exhausted all that, then you just meet your fiscal rules. But if something goes wrong, then you have no leeway. There's no way in which you can alter things in order to be able to perhaps, sort out whatever may be wrong with the economy, because you've got nothing left. So the headroom, if it disappears, means it gives you no flexibility should things go wrong. But it is such a tiny amount, sort of nearly 10 billion, frankly, to make a huge difference. But the markets all look at that. So that's the real issue.
So is that a win or just smoke and mirrors, do you think?
Unfortunately, in order to get to those figures, there's quite a lot of real pain that's involved. It may look like smoke and mirrors for the markets, but if it means cutting welfare spending as significantly as they've just announced that they had to do in order to get the figures to work, then there is huge pain for loads of people. And we've just seen, in fact, the extra cuts that have been announced, that the impact that they make on welfare to hundreds of thousands of people, and how the latest changes that have been introduced may mean that many more people fall into poverty, including children. So the cost is real.
Okay, well, welfare cuts are now £4.8 billion, not the £5 billion that she wanted, although just a couple off, as you say. Labour MPs are fuming. Is this austerity redux, and is she risking a party revolt?
It's not necessarily austerity redone, because What did happen in the October budget, Rachel Reeves' first budget after Labour won the elections, is expand spending very significantly. So over the period of the Parliament, we were having 70 billion per annum extra spending by comparison to where we were in March 2024, which was the last Jeremy Hunt budget. That was going to be financed by 40 billion increase in taxes per annum, higher than would have been the case before, and also borrowing 30 billion. Now, you can't call that austerity. Yes, you could say that the 40 billion tax increase is really a problem because it is increasing even more the share of GDP that is, if you like, collected in terms of taxes. But it was an expansionary budget in a strange sort of way. So all that's happening now is that this expansionary budget is being reduced in its expansion, if you like. But it looks, particularly because of how it falls, as austerity. And because some of the increase, if you like, in the borrowing that's happening, and therefore the spending in many ways, is due or results in having to pay an awful lot more to service the debt, which has been increasing. In fact, we are borrowing more this year than we did last year, and more than the OBR had originally anticipated. This year, by which I mean the fiscal year ending at the beginning of April, we're paying also an awful lot more in servicing that debt because interest rates have stayed high. So bond yields are considerably higher than had been anticipated. They've stayed higher for longer. In fact, if anything, in the last couple of months, they've gone up.
So let's look at defence spending, though. It's always a hot topic in the current climate. She wants to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2027. Drones, AIs, jobs. With growth tanking, can we afford it, or is it too risky a bet?
Well, the way we are affording it, supposedly, is by switching the international aid budget into defence. It has been questioned whether that actually adds up to anything that makes sense, because of the way in which some of the announcements were made. And of course, there is a huge cost in terms of soft power and what it is that you do in relation to how you're helping countries that you really need to help, and does it leave, I don't know, the Chinese and others taking more control of various countries because they provide the aid that you've vacated. But of course, it's happening also in the US with the USAID being cut. So maybe we're following the trend. Anyway, a lot of that is going now into defence because we're reducing the international aid budget to just 0.3% of GDP, even though it had been said by both governments that we have had recently that we were intending to bring it back up. We had reduced it during COVID, but the idea was to bring it back up to 0.7% of GDP. Well, it doesn't look like we're doing it, and it'll be interesting to see whether we ever do. Now, that is meant to go into defence. Which, if that is what it is, we can afford, but the likelihood is that we're probably going to need a little bit more. But what she's doing right now is moving some of that defence, even though it's supposed to be so in the middle of the Parliament when we reach that figure of 2.5, 2.6%. She's moving some money early on into the economy, which I think is good news. So 2.5 billion, I think, of defence spending may be spent just over the next year or two. And that should bring a little bit of growth to the economy that perhaps wouldn't otherwise be there, because defence is really an economic department, if you look at the Department of Defence. So it does have lots of trickle-down impacts. You see manufacturing that will respond. You're going to see a lot of R&D. You're going to see technical stuff. You may even see more people being recruited into the service. Who knows? Because they are having a recruitment problem. I remember reading that for every, I don't know how many you recruit, 100, 110 leave. So it's always very, very difficult to keep people. But yes, I think we're following the trend that loads of other countries are moving into, which is spending more on defence, which I think is absolutely essential right now.
So that £14 billion shortfall keeps coming up. How much is real versus political spin, and are these cuts enough without new taxes?
Well, that 14 billion is supposed to have now been reduced or eliminated. Now we have a 10 billion positive headroom, supposedly. So a lot will depend on what happens to the economy, and I think a lot will depend on growth. what we've seen is that the first year period has been reduced in terms of what expansion we may have in GDP by the OBR from 2% to 1%. So they thought back in October that it would be 2% in 2025. Now it's going to be just 1%. They have a bit faster growth of just under 2% in the years that followed, slightly better than they had envisaged originally. But as people have already pointed out, we've been looking at the details, cumulatively, it's less than what we expected back in October. So that's not good news. If that is the case, then there is an issue in terms of how much tax you collect. And one of the reasons why that gap was there, and the headroom was eliminated more or less, and you had to do something, was because receipts were not going to be as high, income tax receipts and other tax receipts, as would otherwise have been the case and has been forecast originally. So something needed to give, and I think one of the things has been cutting spending of the type we've been discussing, like welfare, for example. Another has been looking at government departments and seeing whether they are a bit more efficient, improving productivity. Well, the interesting thing is that the OBR doesn't really think that productivity can be improved over the period they're looking at. So things could change if suddenly there is a miraculous improvement in productivity. But for the moment, not much evidence of that. So that's where we are. And however, they have managed in this forecast of growth to include an element of sort of dynamic improvement, by which I mean the OBR has looked at some of the changes that the government is making, like defence. I mentioned already, perhaps it should be looked at as an economic ministry, or housing, and opine that that type of spending is likely to improve growth prospects by a bit. And I think certainly by the end of Parliament, possibly by 0.2%. That does sound huge, but it actually does make a difference in terms of what it means on the fiscal side if you have a little bit more growth. And so I think they're counting on that, and it's one of the reasons why they're pushing a lot of that spending early on, housing and defence, which I think is good news for the economy, but whether it's going to give them exactly what they want by the end of the period, we'll see.
And just for the benefit, I always like these explainers with the lowest common denominator, as they say. What is the OBR and why is it important?
This is the Office for Budget Responsibility. It was set up at the time of the coalition government, pretty soon after they came to power. So remember, they came to power in 2010. I think it became effective in 2011 or something like that. It basically sort of materialized out of the Treasury, frankly. So it was a number of officials from the Treasury and Commonwealth sort of moving into there. It has, I think, if I remember correctly, a budget of about 5 million. It isn't huge. And it is run by this, right now, by somebody who came from the Treasury, whereas before it was Robert Choate, who had come from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, and he had been a journalist before. There was a concern at the beginning that it was going to be very Treasury oriented. I mean, after all, the Treasury was doing all this. It's not as if the OBR is doing something new. The Treasury is supposed to have been scrutinising and looking at the details of spending and so on before the budget was announced or anything else, or a spending review. But it was felt that perhaps there needed to be a bit more of independent, inverted commas, oversight. But frankly, it's the same people who probably would have been in the Treasury but moved out of that. And the reason why it's become so important, so for a long time, it was interesting to see the analysis, but at least it was more transparent. You actually saw what was assumed and whether there was any criticism at all, because it was independent, as I said, in inverted commas. But what happened more recently is because of the Liz Truss period, short period, when a budget was introduced without any OBR support, in the sense of looking at the fiscal profile of what the government was in fact offering at the time, and what the implications for the economy and other things might be, including capital markets. The capital markets didn't like it, so a lot of those plans had to be reversed. Suddenly the OBR became such an important part of the whole thing. So that's how they've gained in importance and credibility. And now you can't move without them.
Right. No, that can't move without them. That's a fair summary, isn't it? So the OBR has slashed her £5 billion benefit savings claim to £3 billion. How big a blow is this to her credibility?
Well, they had slashed it. I think, to a little bit more than 3. But because of that, they had to add a few extra measures to bring another 500 million of cuts. And that is a thing which has upset lots of people, if you like, because for a while, even though we as economists obviously had seen through it, for a while there was also the narrative, if you like, that actually we had to do this welfare reform because it was important to get people to work, and it wasn't really for saving money, but it was because we wanted a better culture for work, and it was so important for well-being, etc., which we all know is true. And of course, many things needed to be reformed because what was being spent, particularly for incapacity benefits, was rising very significantly. Something needed to give. But now we know that it was just to square the books. And I think the latest change, which wasn't very big, but it's likely to affect loads of people. And of course, a lot of it has been cut out of any young people in terms of getting extra health benefits below the age of 22. Has angered quite a lot of Labour MPs. So politically, it has not gone down very well. I think Rachel is going to have to rethink the narrative on this. We can see now clearly it was done for fiscal reasons and nothing else.
So, well, stay with us. After the break, we'll dig into the UK's stagnation and the global economic storm with Vicky Pryce. You're watching the Andrew Eborn Show. Don't touch that dial.
Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Okay, welcome back to the Andrew Eborn Show with me, Andrew Eborn, joined by the brilliant Vicky Pryce, who's been on more platforms than Paddington, just like me today, popular as ever. Vicky, the UK economy shrank by 0.1% in January and growth flatlined under Labour. Are we in a stagnation trap? And what's one bold fix Reeves is missing?
Well, it's worth bearing in mind that the Office of Budgetary Responsibility now thinks we're only going to grow by 1% when they thought it would grow by 2%. But that is considerably better than what we've done in the last few years. Admittedly, in 2024, I think we grew by 0.8 or 0.9 when all the figures are put together in the right way. But yes, you're right. The second half of 24 was more or less stagnant. And the beginning wasn't fantastically good. We had some revival in December, 0.4% growth. Then we had a drop in January, and that really upset markets. Now, what's been happening since? I mean, the interesting thing is that, yes, business confidence has been affected. We don't have quite the type of investment or the increase that had been hoped for. Interest rates haven't come down as fast as we had hoped because inflation has stayed a little bit higher, or at least there are worries about inflation staying higher, mainly because of tariffs and so on. And that has affected prospects, not just the ones that the OBR has put together, but also any economist who has looked at how the UK might do has revised the forecast down. And in fact, the Bank of England itself, just a couple of months ago, revised their forecast to just 0.75%. So it means not great improvement for 2024, which is disappointing, of course. It's certainly disappointing in terms of tax receipts on the fiscal side. So it matters. I wouldn't call it stagflation because it's not as if we're unlikely to grow completely, but it is pretty worrying. The service sector is beginning to show signs of revival. So there's something going on there. Retail sales are improving. People have more money in their pockets, although they pay more tax, but they have more money in their pockets because real wages are rising, continue to rise. Unemployment, as I touched on earlier, yes, it's gone up a little bit as an unemployment rate, but at 4.4% is still pretty acceptable. They're about to see an increase in minimum wage above inflation. Public sector has received a lot of pay. Yes, more tax is being paid because of freezing of thresholds, but there is also the issue of big savings that were made during COVID. The savings ratio is quite high in the UK. It could be spent if there is a bit more confidence by the consumer, and that should be a help. On the other hand, manufacturing has been declining, more or less. There's been the odd month of growth, but if you look at the latest data, I mean, it's shrinking rather rapidly. And that, of course, will get worse with the tariffs. And we may say, well, who needs manufacturing? But actually, loads of services depend on manufacturing, very linked to it. I mean, if you look at any company these days, they could be classified as a manufacturing capital, but a lot of what they do is services. And if the bit of manufacturing isn't there, then what's going to happen to the rest of it? So there are worries. And then because of the national insurance contribution increase, there is the concern that businesses are either not going to invest, or they're not going to hire people, or they're going to pass the extra costs on to consumers, or they might do all three. And that isn't going to be good for the economy. So there are big question marks in what the OBR has just produced. And then, of course, you've got tariffs and geopolitics to add to this. So, don't know, finger up in the air and hope it moves you in a certain direction. You can guess what may happen, but we don't know how will it end up at the end of 2025.
You've often spoken about here on the Andrew Eborn Show about the Brexit's damage. With no single market talk, are we doomed to lag the Eurozone?
Well, the Eurozone hasn't done particularly well recently, mainly because Germany was so dependent on Russian gas, and generally, of course, what we've seen is there's been a sort of spread across the whole Eurozone of the malaise that we've seen in Germany. Although some of the southern European countries have continued to do quite well, mainly because of the resurgence in tourism. So if you look at Spain, Italy, Greece, I mean, they've done rather well by comparison to the rest. But yes, there is an issue as to what that whole continent will do. The interesting thing is that, of course, Brexit has made a big difference in terms of exporting to the EU on the goods side. Loads and loads of bureaucratic problems, which mainly, well, they act as tariffs, but they're not tariffs, which make it very difficult to export and import. So our trade intensity has gone down. Services have stayed reasonably buoyant, which is good news. But we haven't really been able to make up for the loss in the EU by suddenly exporting an awful lot to others. And as a single country buyer of our goods, the US, I'm afraid, remains very important. The EU is bigger when you put them all together, but if the US decides to make life harder for us, now the question is, can we really turn to the EU as we always have done to make up for it? So I think Brexit matters hugely, and we do need to get closer. And it's not just me who's saying it. I think it's now become an acceptable thing to say by loads of people, people at the centre and the left, who were very worried until recently to appear to be pro-EU, fearing any attack from the Reform Party. But it's now become almost acceptable to say that Brexit is an issue. When you listen to the British Chambers of Commerce, for example, and all their comments recently, they have been saying that better links with the EU are an absolute must. And of course, we will hopefully have better links on the defence side, and we should build on those in order to get closer.
And we'll be back after the news headlines.
Today's News Talk, The Pulse.
You're here watching the Andrew Eborn Show with me, Andrew Eborn, joined by Vicky Pryce. We touched just before the break about U-turns, and I'm always reminded of that wonderful Maggie Thatcher quote. To those of you waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The lady's tot for turning. I say that not only to you, but to our friends overseas, and also to those who are not our friends. You were using that in terms of Brexit. Your view is we should rethink it, is that right?
Yes, we certainly should rethink it because of the economy. And it's really rather interesting because I was listening to one particular interview where the question was raised about, why did we have such a big increase in the number of civil servants? One of the things that the government wants to cut, and it's also included in terms of savings of costs of running departments in what has been put out today as part of the spring statement. And the question was asked of a Conservative, maybe it was actually Mel Stride who was being asked that, but I may be wrong. And the question was, but surely you increased all the numbers while you were in power because of Brexit. That's really what's caused it, and doing all these new regulations and so on. And his answer was, no, that was very, very marginal. It wasn't really important at all in raising the numbers. But of course, the question that should have been asked should have been, well, so what was the point? You said that it was all being controlled by Europe. If you're saying that actually what you've taken on to replace it has been minimal, then it wasn't really a big issue, but it wasn't asked. So they missed the trick in some ways, because it has caused a huge amount of worries for businesses, particularly for smaller firms. And we have already seen that about a third of SMEs that used to export to Europe have stopped doing so. And that's a real problem. Of course, the big firms can survive it, but if you lose the SMEs, you also lose the increase in productivity, competitiveness, and all that sort of stuff, which is absolutely essential to keep going. And I think that's the main issue. It's not so much, whether you think we should be part of Europe or not. It is that from an economic viewpoint, losing the single market and the ease with which you could bring people in, and also we've got the problems with that now, because we have to bring them from elsewhere with very, very expensive visas for businesses, and also, of course, goods being transported easily. Supply chains. The Germans never really wanted us to leave because the car industry is so dependent on what happens here in the UK as well. So the German car industry. Those are issues that need to be rethought, and I'm not suggesting necessarily that we should perhaps rejoin tomorrow, but certainly on the trade front we should be doing better than we're doing at present.
So businesses are reeling from the national insurance hikes and wage rises. Is Rachel Reeves choking the private sector when we need it most?
There is a worry. Now, of course, businesses always complain in advance. I mean, who knows? They might be able to take it in their stride. But we do know, nevertheless, that for individuals who work in those firms, they may find it much harder keeping that employment going, because the costs for those at the lower end of the pay scale in companies are the ones where the cost will be felt by businesses most. So if they employ lots of part-time workers, women who do that part-time work, and they earn anything above £100 a month, a week, forgive me, then what you find is that their cost for them goes up very significantly. So that's the real problem of reducing the threshold. It's not so much the increase in the actual rate of the national insurance contributions, which has only gone up by about 1.5%, but it is really the capping the threshold at just £5,000, which is a real problem for firms that employ people at the lower end of the pay scale.
Trump's back with tariff threats on Canada, Mexico, China, and maybe the EU. How exposed is the UK, and could it tip us into recession?
It is a problem, although we're not as dependent as Canada and Mexico are on the US, where, of course, Canada exports a huge amount of its exports go straight to the US, and where, for example, I mentioned the car industry a few times. The car industry is so integrated between the three countries that it's a real issue if you make it much harder to import some of the parts that you need for the car industry into the US, and also, of course, the other way, because Canada certainly has put reciprocal tariffs, and it probably intends to do more if Trump adds to whatever he's done so far. So it's a real issue for them, and what we've seen already is that their growth has been reduced very considerably in terms of what is expected for 2025. It's interesting to see that the OECD, for example, instead of something like 2% growth for Canada for this year, has reduced it to 0.7%, and for Mexico it's moved it from positive to negative. So it really does matter. Now, how is the UK within all this? And the interesting thing is that the OECD thinks that the UK is actually likely to be quite affected too, because we depend so much ourselves as a single country in terms of our exports on the US, that I think, again, from what I remember, we are almost sort of number 4 in the list of countries that are most likely to be affected by tariffs, and that's interesting. Of course, Germany will be affected and so on, but loads of parts of Europe are not at all, not much. Yes, France with its agriculture exports, champagne and things like that. But otherwise, because of manufacturing, we do export quite a lot of parts, vehicles, trucks, chemicals, pharmaceuticals. A lot of those will be affected. And they are, of course, also the areas that we really would like to grow further. and where a lot of our regions have a big stake in, and they will be affected, and that's a real problem.
And now inflation is at 2.8% above target, and gilt rates are spiking. Again, with our unpacking, getting rid of jargon, what are gilt rates, and are rate cuts off the table?
Gilt rates is basically the interest you have to pay to borrow for the government in the capital markets. So the government issues bonds, and it says, I'm going to be paying you a certain amount of interest, which is fixed usually every year, and you lend me £100, for example, for that, and I'll pay you, 10% per annum, or £10 per annum rather than 10% per annum. And if you calculate what that means, it is that for £100, 10%, £10 means 10%. But that rate is fixed. So if you suddenly have loads and loads of people who want to buy many more bonds, then they raise the price of that bond that's there, because you can exchange it, you can sell it in the market. The interest rate you get stays the same in actual terms, in the sense that it is still £10. But if the bond price has gone up to 200, say, then the yield on that bond goes down to 5%. It's the same amount, but obviously £10 for 200 is 5%, for 100 it was just 10. So you suddenly have that improvement, which means really that the market adjusts. So next time you go out to borrow, the market is prepared to lend you or hold this interest at this bond at just 5% interest, effectively. So you can actually borrow more cheaply. It can move the other way, and this is exactly where we are now. That what has been happening is that bond yields have been going up, so the markets want more interest to hold your debt, and therefore every time you go out and borrow in the market, you have to pay more in terms of interest to whoever is prepared to lend you the money than was the case before. And that means, unfortunately for the government, that the bill for servicing the debt, in other words, paying that interest to the people who hold your debt, goes up very significantly. And what is happening right now is that one of the problems of the government is that the debt interest payments now are something like anywhere between, and I think the latest one was higher than we had thought, 100 billion to 110 billion a year that you have to pay to just service your debt. So it's very bad news to have high bond yields, which is more or less where we are now. In fact, our yields are the same, if not slightly higher, than they were after the panic around the Liz Truss mini budget, or rather Quatern's mini budget.
So let's look at global power shift. I mean, is the US fading as an economic leader while China holds firm? Where does that leave Britain?
As an economic leader, it's an interesting question because, of course, as an economy, they remain the largest economy. And as a country whose currency is used for transactions, foreign exchange, and also for trade, they still remain tops. But that is declining, has been declining for quite some time. And now, of course, they want to withdraw from having a sort of center stage, if you like, in terms of supporting various nations. They are making it a little bit harder for anyone to have a continuous interest in holding the dollar and in buying into government assets. And that's the real problem. Of course, what this means is that perhaps it's becoming more interesting to invest in the UK. And we've seen a little bit of that already in terms of surveys suggesting this, but also loads of Europeans are trying to attract money that may be leaving the States, money that may not go into the States but come here instead from other countries. People, scientists and so on. I think the French have already started in a big way trying to attract brains from the US. So it's interesting, we might see this little shift, but at the same time, what it also means is that other countries like the BRICS, which is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which was the original group and now it's been added to by lots of others, may become another center of power with maybe their own currencies and not using necessarily the dollar or even the payment systems that the West has developed. So we are at a point where it could actually move that way and the dollar's dominance might decline. I don't think the US quite realizes perhaps what benefit you get from having the type of currency which everyone wants to hold, because you can easily raise money in the markets without too much difficulty because of that. But there is a shift happening, and it may accelerate over the next 10 years.
Now, the OBR says living standards will flatline. What does that mean in practical terms for families, and can Labour turn it around?
Well, the interesting thing is that real incomes are per head are improving per capita a little bit. Although, of course, what we have seen is a long period when that wasn't happening, and then a little bit of an improvement in the last few months, but that could go the other way. We're having the expectation of a big increase in continuous increase in population happening, and who knows how all that will be spread. But what I think you will be seeing, probably because of all those measures, is that there's a little bit more inequality. The welfare cuts are certainly going to affect a particular part of the population. The national insurance contributions increase if it hits the lower paid, because they become much more expensive because of the way that the changes are taking place. They may lose more in terms of both jobs and income, and that's a real problem. Moving into poverty, more people moving into poverty because of those changes is also a concern. So there are dangers there that in fact we might see the average real incomes perhaps getting worse. But on the other hand, wages are rising quite substantially still, way above inflation, and for the moment anyway, the labour market remains pretty buoyant, despite the fact that for the moment the surveys, not despite the fact, perhaps despite the fact that surveys suggest that companies are cutting back, but for the moment you still have shortages in many areas and pay going up for quite a few people.
Reeves calls her fiscal rules non-negotiable. What are they, and are they too rigid for these times?
Well, there are two rules. One is not to borrow really for day-to-day spending, but actually fund it from tax increases. That isn't really going to be met for a while, but the plan is that it will be met later in this parliament. We'll see if that happens. And the second one is that overall debt to GDP ratio comes down. It's a rolling average, if you like, but actually at the end of a particular period, usually 5 years, it could actually be brought forward a little bit, but that's what the rule is. But that you do borrow, of course, to invest. But that borrowing to invest is included in that debt to GDP figure, which needs to come down over a period. Those are the rules that she needs to keep. Now, the question is, does she have to do so? For the moment, she doesn't have the confidence to move away from that. She fears about the bond markets reacting negatively, but we're seeing lots and lots of other countries doing exactly that, moving away from very strict constraints. Germany is doing it right now. What we're seeing also in Europe, that the European Stability and Growth Pact is being eased a little bit again to allow for extra borrowing on defence in particular, without being punished for exceeding some of the deficit requirements that you have. So she could do that, and at some point she may decide to do so if circumstances improve and market sentiment generally improves in the next few years. But for the moment, bond rates are rather high, and she probably thinks that the cost of servicing the debt is going to be enormous, and it's not worth going down their routes. But things could change, markets could change. And as you were suggesting earlier, particularly, there's a lot of move away from funding the US deficit into funding, being more prepared to fund European deficits and debt, then we might be beneficiaries of this.
Okay, well, hold tight. We're wrapping up with Vicky Pryce's big takeaway after this short break. You're watching The Pulse today with me, Andrew Eborn. Don't touch that dial.
Are we on the air?
Am I on the air? You're on the air?
On the air 24/7. Your news talk giant. The Pulse.
Well, welcome back to the Andrew Eborn Show with me, Andrew Eborn, and a quick wrap-up from Vicky before the media demands overtake us. Very quickly, Vicky, we keep hearing GDP. What is it in plain English, and why is 0.1% drop a big deal?
Well, it's a gross domestic product. Now, the way you calculate GDP, there's more than one way. This is where a lot of the confusion is. You could calculate all the output of an economy, which is more or less what GDP is supposed to be saying. But it should be more or less the same as all the spending that you do in the economy, and more or less the same as all the income that's generated in the economy. So the three should be more or less equal, but of course they never are. But that is what it is. It estimates activity in the economy. It estimates what is produced. It estimates what you go out and spend in the shops. It estimates what you get paid for doing your job, because of course if you get paid, you either pay your tax or you go and spend it somewhere, or you save it. So all that adds up to the overall picture of what the economy generates, if you like, in a year, and it's calculated yearly. So there could be times when it falls. In other words, what you generate is not as high as it was before, and that was certainly the case during COVID, when we saw this very substantial fall. Because if you remember, nobody was going out to work, very little was being produced. Actually, it's not nobody, there were loads of people who did. Nurses, doctors, so we have to acknowledge all that half of the population still went to work. The rest of us hid while they went out and kept us going, for which we're very grateful. But of course, GDP fell very substantially. Supply chains were interrupted. There was, no exporting, importing. And then when restrictions started being lifted, then there was a real problem with supply chains, everything being in the wrong place. But then GDP recovered, but with it inflation as well. So that's basically what it calculates. And it should really do it without looking at inflation, in other words, real, so extracting from the figures how prices have risen, so you can actually get a feel of the real production, the car outside which has been built, for example, rather than just inflating it with the price changes that have taken place, because that doesn't give you a real idea of what is actually produced. And
And the
comparing
0.1%
like with
is
like.
not a big deal?
0.1% in January, it is only as an indication that things are not going particularly well. It could be revised to 0.1% up, could be revised to 0, of course, but it does suggest that we're just not really growing, because growing by 0.1%, if that is the revision, doesn't really make very much difference. It just tells you that not much is produced somehow, and we're stagnating. Perhaps there's nothing wrong with stagnating for a bit, but only for a bit.
Now, there's chatter about a 10 billion in stealth taxes via frozen thresholds. What's a stealth tax and how does it hit us?
Everybody pays tax. No, those who earn above a certain threshold pay tax. Not everyone pays tax. I think a very large percentage of the population doesn't pay tax, but many, many more now do. And that is because the threshold from which you start paying tax, which is just over £12,000 now, has been frozen for a number of years, which means that as you get paid more, let's say you get a 10% rise and you're earning sort of 11,500, suddenly you find yourself starting to pay tax for the first time. And also the higher rates, because again the threshold is fixed, you move much faster into the higher rate of paying tax at 40%, and then also the rate of paying tax at 45%. So all those thresholds have been frozen, from which you move from one tax rate to another, and that, of course, in fact, for the higher tax rate, it's come down. So it isn't just frozen; it's reduced. So it means that one pays a lot more tax, and I think what is often forgotten is partly because of that, is that people at the higher end pay a lot more tax than you think. So the top 1% of earners pay nearly 30% of all the tax, income tax, that comes to the UK, the UK's Treasury, so HMRC or whoever, the Exchequer. So that's basically what it is. The question is, will this threshold remain frozen? And there had been the promise that this was going to be liberated in a couple of years' time, but it is entirely possible that come next autumn we'll see that actually that is frozen, stays where it has been, in order again to improve the fiscal position of the government.
Fantastic. Well, we'll keep following that. It's been brilliant as always having you on. You've unpacked a lot of spring statement, UK woes and global chaos. What's the one big takeaway for our brilliant audience to watch in the months ahead?
Well, look at the figures a little bit more, and don't think that this is the end of it. There could be more uncertainty ahead, both on the positive side and on the negative side. I'm trying to think of something semi-positive to say. But I would be surprised if we didn't have more tax changes happening, possibly increases come next autumn.
Okay, Vicky Pryce, you've been phenomenal as always. Thank you so much for guiding us through this economic roller coaster. And that's it for today. Do join me same time, same place tomorrow. But for me, for now, from Andrew Eborn, thanks a lot for joining us. We'll see you next time.
To hear a replay of this hour, go to episodes at thepulse.today. This is today's News Talk, The Pulse.